Madison Square Garden, 1999. 17,000 fans screaming as Whitney Houston delivers what appears to be the performance of her career. Her mother, Cissy Houston, sits in the VIP section watching her daughter command the stage with that voice that had changed music history. Every note perfect, every movement graceful, everything the world expected from the greatest voice of a generation. But something feels wrong. Only a mother would notice the slight tremor in Whitney's hand between songs. Only a mother would see the way her daughter's smile doesn't quite reach her eyes. Only a mother would recognize the familiar signs of someone hiding a devastating secret. When Whitney announces a brief intermission, Cissy makes a decision that will shatter her heart into 1,000 pieces. She's going backstage. What she discovers in her daughter's dressing room will force her to confront the most painful truth any parent can face. The child you thought you knew is disappearing, and you might be powerless to save her. Cissy Houston had spent her entire life in the music industry. She had sung backup for Aretha Franklin, Elvis Presley, and had been part of the legendary Sweet Inspirations. She understood pressure. She understood perfectionism. She understood what it meant to sacrifice everything for your art. But nothing had prepared her for watching her own daughter carry the weight of being Whitney Houston. That December night at Madison Square Garden should have been a celebration. Whitney was closing out the decade as one of the most successful artists in history. 7 consecutive #1 hits, over 100 million records sold worldwide. A voice that musicologists were already calling once in a century. But Cissy Houston, sitting in the darkness of the VIP section, wasn't thinking about any of those achievements. She was thinking about the phone call she had received 3 days earlier from Whitney's assistant. A quiet, careful conversation that had been full of what wasn't being said. "Mrs. Houston, I think you should come to the New York shows," the assistant had said, her voice tight with tension. "Whitney has been asking about you. She needs family around right now." The carefully chosen words had set off alarm bells in Cissy's mind. Whitney never asked for family during tour runs. She had spent years creating distance between her professional life and her personal relationships, building walls that even her mother struggled to penetrate. Something was very wrong. As Cissy watched Whitney perform that night, she cataloged every detail with a mother's instinct and a professional singer's eye. Whitney's breath control was off, not by much, but enough that Cissy could hear her daughter pushing harder than necessary to hit notes that should have been effortless. The sparkle of her costume couldn't quite hide how much weight she had lost. Her movements, while still graceful, had a frantic quality, as if staying in motion was the only way to avoid falling apart. During "I Will Always Love You," Whitney's signature song, Cissy saw something that made her blood run cold. As Whitney held the climactic note that had made her famous, her hand reached for the microphone stand not for dramatic effect, but for support. Her daughter was struggling, and 17,000 people were too caught up in the magic to notice. When Whitney announced the intermission, her voice had a quality Cissy had never heard before, a brittleness beneath the warmth, like glass about to shatter. "I'll be right back, New York," Whitney said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile. "Don't go anywhere." As the lights came up and the crowd began chatting and moving about, Cissy Houston made a decision that would change everything. She was going backstage, and this time she wasn't going to accept the carefully constructed facade her daughter had been hiding behind. The backstage area of Madison Square Garden during a Whitney Houston show was typically controlled chaos. Tour managers, musicians, costume designers, and security all moving with practiced precision. But as Cissy Houston made her way through the corridors, using her VIP credentials and the authority that came with being Whitney's mother, she noticed something strange. People were avoiding her eyes. Conversations stopped as she passed. The usual warmth she received from Whitney's team was replaced with uncomfortable politeness. "Mrs. Houston," Whitney's tour manager intercepted her just outside the dressing room corridor. "Whitney's changing for the second half. Maybe you could come back after the show." Cissy looked at the young man, really looked at him, and saw the desperation in his eyes. He wasn't trying to manage her access to Whitney. He was trying to protect her from what she was about to see. "Step aside, baby," Cissy said gently but firmly. "That's my daughter in there, and I'm going to see her now." The tour manager hesitated, then nodded slowly and moved out of her way. As Cissy approached Whitney's dressing room, she could hear voices inside, raised and tense. One was Whitney's, sharp and defensive. The other was male, aggressive and controlling. Bobby Brown. Cissy's heart began to pound as she reached for the door handle. The argument inside stopped the moment she opened the door. The scene that greeted her would be burned into her memory forever. Whitney stood in front of her makeup mirror, wearing only a silk robe, her famous costume discarded on the floor. Her daughter, who had always been so careful about her appearance, looked ravaged. The weight loss that had been noticeable on stage was shocking up close. Whitney's collarbones protruded sharply. Her arms were so thin that Cissy could see every tendon and vein. Dark circles under her eyes were only partially hidden by hastily applied makeup. But it was what Cissy saw on the makeup counter that made her knees weak. Pill bottles. At least 7 of them, scattered among the makeup brushes and hair products. Some were prescription bottles with Whitney's name on them, but others had no labels at all. Next to them was a small mirror with residue on it, the kind of residue that Cissy, who had spent her life around musicians and their demons, recognized immediately. Bobby Brown stood in the corner of the room, his posture defensive and territorial. The moment he saw Cissy, his expression hardened. "This is a private moment," he said, his voice carrying an edge of threat. "Whitney's getting ready for the second half." Cissy ignored him completely, her eyes locked on her daughter. "Whitney," she said softly, her voice steady despite the terror flooding through her. "Baby, what's going on?" Whitney's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Shock at seeing her mother, shame at being caught, defiance at the unspoken accusation, and finally, a desperate attempt to reconstruct the facade. "Mama," Whitney said, her voice too bright, too fast. "What are you doing back here? You should be enjoying the show from your seat. I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long tour." Cissy took a step into the room, her professional training keeping her voice calm even as her heart shattered. "Don't lie to me, Whitney Elizabeth. Not to me, not about this." The room fell silent. Bobby Brown moved toward Whitney protectively, or possessively, Cissy couldn't tell which. Whitney's hands began to shake, and she quickly clasped them together to hide the tremor. "I don't know what you think you're seeing," Whitney said, her voice dropping to something harder, more defensive. "But I'm handling my business. I always do." Cissy Houston had sung professionally for 40 years. She had performed through heartbreak, exhaustion, and loss. She knew how to maintain composure under pressure. But standing in that dressing room, looking at the evidence of her daughter's addictions scattered across the makeup counter, she felt something inside her break. "How long?" Cissy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" Whitney's defenses crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Cissy saw not the superstar her daughter had become, but the little girl who used to sing in the church choir, the child who had once looked at her mother with uncomplicated love and trust. "Mama, please," Whitney whispered, tears beginning to stream down her face, cutting tracks through her stage makeup. "Please don't do this here, not now. I have to go back out there. 17,000 people are waiting." "Let them wait," Cissy said firmly, moving closer to her daughter. "Right now, the only person who matters is you. Talk to me, baby. Talk to your mama." Bobby Brown stepped forward, his voice aggressive. "She doesn't have to explain anything to you. This is our life, our business. You don't get to come in here and judge us." Cissy finally turned to face Bobby, and the look in her eyes made him take a step back. "This is my daughter," she said, each word carrying the weight of every fear, every sleepless night, every prayer she had offered for Whitney's safety. "I carried her. I raised her. I taught her to sing when she was barely old enough to talk. Don't you dare tell me I don't have a right to care about what's destroying her." Whitney moved between them, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Stop, both of you just stop." She looked at Bobby. "Give me a minute with my mother, please." Bobby's jaw tightened, but after a tense moment he nodded and left the room, though not without shooting Cissy a look that promised this conversation wasn't over. Once the door closed, Whitney collapsed into her makeup chair, her head in her hands. "I'm so tired, Mama," she whispered. "I'm so tired of pretending everything's okay when it's not. I'm tired of being Whitney Houston." Cissy knelt beside her daughter's chair, taking Whitney's thin hands in her own. "Then stop being Whitney Houston for a minute and just be my Whitney, my baby girl. Tell me what's happening." What followed was a confession that would haunt Cissy Houston for the rest of her life. Whitney told her everything. About the pills that had started as a way to manage the exhausting demands of touring, the long flights, the back-to-back performances, the endless promotional appearances. About how the pills had stopped being enough, and Bobby had introduced her to harder substances that made everything feel manageable again. About the weight of expectations, the constant scrutiny, the pressure to be perfect every single moment. about how the drugs were the only thing that quieted the voice in her head that kept saying she wasn't good enough, wasn't talented enough, wasn't worthy of everything she had achieved. "I know it's wrong," Whitney said, her voice breaking. "I know I'm destroying myself, but Mama, you don't understand what it's like. Everyone wants a piece of me. Everyone has expectations. Clive wants hit records. The label wants perfection. The fans want the Whitney they fell in love with. Bobby wants a wife who can keep up with him. And you want me to be the good church girl who never makes mistakes." Cissy felt tears streaming down her own face now. "I want you to be alive, Whitney. That's all I want. I want you to wake up tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. Everything else, every song, every award, every achievement, none of it matters if you're not here." Whitney looked at her mother with eyes that held years of pain and exhaustion. "I don't know how to be here anymore, Mama. I don't know how to be me without the drugs. I don't even remember who I was before all of this." A knock on the door interrupted them. The tour manager's voice came through, apologetic but firm. "Whitney, we need you on stage in 10 minutes. The crowd's getting restless." Whitney wiped her eyes and began the process of reconstructing her appearance, fixing her makeup with practiced efficiency. "I have to go," she said to Cissy. "I have to finish the show." Cissy Houston watched her daughter transform before her eyes. The vulnerable, broken woman who had just confessed her addiction disappeared, replaced by the carefully constructed image of Whitney Houston, superstar. Fresh makeup covered the tear stains. A brilliant smile replaced the expression of pain. The trembling hands steadied as Whitney reached for her costume. "You can't go back out there," Cissy said desperately. "Whitney, baby, you need help. Real help. We need to cancel the rest of the show, cancel the rest of the tour, and get you into treatment. Today, right now." Whitney paused in the middle of fastening her costume, and for a moment, Cissy saw hope flicker in her daughter's eyes, the possibility of escape, of rest, of healing. But then Whitney shook her head, and the moment was gone. "I can't, Mama. I have contracts. People have paid money to see me perform. The tour employs hundreds of people who depend on these shows for their livelihood. I can't just walk away. Those people will find other jobs," Cissy said, her voice urgent. "Other tour, other artists, but you only have one life, Whitney. And you're gambling with it every time you use those drugs. You know what those things can do. You've seen what happened to other artists who went down this road." Whitney's face hardened, the defensive walls going back up. "I'm not them. I'm stronger than they were. I can handle this. I just need to get through this tour and then I'll take a break. I promise, Mama. After the tour, I'll get help." It was a promise Cissy had heard before, in different forms from different people. Artists she had worked with over the years, friends who had struggled with their own demons, musicians who had sworn they would quit after just one more show, one more tour, one more album. She knew the pattern, knew how these stories ended, and the knowledge filled her with terror. "I'm calling your doctor," Cissy said, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling Clive Davis. I'm calling everyone who has the power to stop this tour right now, tonight, before you hurt yourself or worse." Whitney's hand shot out and grabbed her mother's wrist with surprising strength. "If you do that," she said, her voice cold and hard in a way Cissy had never heard before, "I will never speak to you again. I mean it, Mama. You make those calls and you lose me forever." The threat hung in the air between them, more devastating than any physical blow. Cissy looked into her daughter's eyes and saw the addiction looking back, saw the disease that had its hooks so deep in Whitney that it was willing to destroy everything, even the bond between mother and daughter, to protect itself. "You're asking me to watch you die," Cissy whispered. "You're asking me to stand by and do nothing while you destroy yourself. How can I do that? How can any mother do that?" Whitney's expression softened slightly, and she released her mother's wrist. "I'm asking you to trust me, to believe that I'm strong enough to handle this, to give me the space to figure this out on my own terms." Another knock on the door, more insistent this time. "Whitney, 5 minutes. They're starting to chant your name." Whitney looked at her mother one last time, and Cissy saw everything in that look. The love that had never died despite the distance between them, the shame of being caught in her addiction, the desperate hope that her mother would choose to believe the lie that everything would be okay. And beneath it all, a plea. "Please don't make me choose between you and the drugs, because we both know which one I'll pick right now." Cissy Houston had to make an impossible decision in that moment. She could force a confrontation, could make the calls she had threatened to make, could try to use her influence and authority to shut down the tour and force Whitney into treatment. But in doing so, she would drive her daughter away, perhaps permanently, and lose any chance of being there when Whitney finally hit bottom and needed her mother's support. Or she could step back, give Whitney the space she was demanding, and pray that her daughter would find the strength to save herself before it was too late. It was the kind of decision that no parent should ever have to make, but millions do. The choice between tough love and unconditional acceptance, between intervention and faith, between acting and waiting. Cissy made her choice. "I love you," she said, pulling Whitney into a tight embrace. "No matter what happens, no matter where this road takes you, I love you. And when you're ready, when you finally decide you want help, I will be there. I will always be there." Whitney hugged her mother back, and for just a moment they were simply mother and daughter, holding onto each other in the midst of a storm. "I love you too, Mama," Whitney whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of this." Cissy Houston did not return to her seat in the VIP section for the second half of Whitney's concert. Instead, she stood in the wings, watching from the shadows as her daughter walked back onto that stage and transformed once again into the superstar the world expected. The crowd's roar was deafening as Whitney launched into "I'm Every Woman," moving across the stage with energy that seemed impossible given what Cissy had just witnessed backstage. But Cissy knew the truth now. She knew that every note, every smile, every moment of apparent joy was being powered by substances that were slowly killing her daughter. She knew that the voice that had moved millions was being destroyed from the inside by chemicals and abuse. She knew that the woman the world worshipped as a goddess was barely holding herself together. As Whitney sang, Cissy found herself praying. Not the formal prayers of church service, but the desperate, wordless prayers of a mother watching her child suffer. "Please, God, please save my baby. Please give her the strength to save herself. Please don't let me lose her. Not like this. Not yet." The concert continued, and Whitney delivered what most of the audience would describe as a flawless performance. They saw the charisma, the talent, the star power. They didn't see the tremors between songs, the way Whitney gripped the microphone stand for support, the moment during Greatest Love of All when her voice cracked, and she had to start the verse again, covering the mistake with a laugh and a comment about being overwhelmed by New York's energy. Cissy saw all of it, saw her daughter falling apart in slow motion in front of 17,000 people who were too dazzled by the spectacle to notice the tragedy unfolding before them. When Whitney finally took her bows and left the stage for the final time that night, Cissy was waiting in the wings. Bobby Brown was there too, along with the tour manager and several members of Whitney's team. They all stood in uncomfortable silence as Whitney, still riding the adrenaline of the performance, made her way toward them. "That was incredible," the tour manager said enthusiastically. "The crowd loved you. Social media is already blowing up about tonight's show." Whitney smiled, accepting the praise, but her eyes found her mother's, and the smile faltered slightly. "Mama," she said quietly, "you stayed." Cissy nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. She wanted to say so much, wanted to grab her daughter and run, wanted to turn back time and prevent whatever choices had led them to this moment. But all she could do was stand there and watch as Bobby Brown put his arm around Whitney possessively and began leading her toward the dressing room. "Whitney," Cissy called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "I meant what I said. When you're ready, I'm here, always." Whitney paused, looked back at her mother, and for just a moment, Cissy saw her little girl again, the child who had sung in church, who had dreamed of using her voice to touch people's hearts, who had been so full of hope and promise. "I know, Mama," Whitney said softly. "I know." Cissy Houston did not speak publicly about what she saw in Whitney's dressing room that December night in 1999. She kept her daughter's secret, protected her privacy, and continued to be a presence in Whitney's life, even as the addiction grew worse over the following years. She watched from a distance as Whitney's marriage to Bobby Brown became more volatile and public. She saw the tabloid headlines, the paparazzi photos that showed her daughter's deteriorating condition, the canceled concerts and erratic behavior that gradually replaced the perfection Whitney had once represented. There were other interventions, other attempts by family and friends to get Whitney help. Some were successful for brief periods. Whitney would enter treatment, emerge seemingly recovered, talk about her renewed commitment to health and sobriety. But the disease always came back. Always found a way to sink its hooks back into her daughter. Cissy never stopped praying, never stopped hoping that the next intervention would be the one that worked, that Whitney would finally find the strength to break free of the addiction that had taken over her life. She was there during the good moments, the brief periods of sobriety when her daughter seemed like herself again, when the light would come back into Whitney's eyes and she would talk about future plans and dreams. And she was there during the dark moments, the relapses and the despair, the phone calls in the middle of the night when Whitney needed someone to talk to, someone who would listen without judgment. The night Cissy had discovered the truth backstage at Madison Square Garden became a turning point, not because it led to immediate recovery, but because it marked the end of pretending. From that moment on, Cissy knew the full extent of what her daughter was fighting, and Whitney knew that her mother knew. The secrets were gone, replaced by a painful honesty that would define their relationship for the remaining years of Whitney's life. Years later, Cissy would tell a journalist that the hardest thing about loving an addict is accepting that love alone cannot save them. You can give everything, sacrifice everything, pray with every fiber of your being, and still watch helplessly as the disease destroys the person you love. The only thing you can do is be there, be present, be ready for the moment when they finally decide they want to save themselves. For Whitney Houston, that moment came too late. By the time she was finally ready to commit fully to recovery, the damage to her body and spirit was too extensive. The voice that had once moved millions was a shadow of its former glory, and the woman who had once radiated confidence and joy struggled to find reasons to keep fighting. But Cissy Houston never regretted the choice she made that night at Madison Square Garden. She never regretted choosing to maintain her relationship with Whitney rather than forcing a confrontation that might have driven her daughter away. Because in the end, what mattered most was that Whitney knew she was loved, not for her talent or her success or her achievements, but simply for being Cissy's daughter. That unconditional love, that unwavering presence, gave Whitney comfort in her darkest moments and peace in her final days. It wasn't enough to save her, but it was enough to let her know she didn't have to face her demons alone. The story of that December night in 1999, when Cissy Houston discovered the full truth about her daughter's addiction, is ultimately a story about the impossible choices parents face when their children are in crisis. There are no perfect answers, no guaranteed solutions, no roadmap that promises success. There is only love, imperfect and insufficient, but absolutely necessary. For every parent watching a child struggle with addiction, mental illness, or any form of self-destruction, Cissy Houston's story offers both heartbreak and hope. The heartbreak of acknowledging that love cannot always save someone who is determined to destroy themselves. And the hope that even when we cannot save them, we can still love them, still be present, still offer a lifeline that they might one day be strong enough to grab. Whitney Houston's story ended tragically in February 2012, when she was found dead in a hotel bathtub on the eve of the Grammy Awards. The official cause was accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use listed as contributing factors. She was just 48 years old. Cissy Houston was devastated but not surprised. She had known for years that this outcome was possible, had lived with the daily terror that each phone call might be the one telling her that Whitney was gone. In the years since her daughter's death, Cissy has spoken more openly about Whitney's struggles, about that night at Madison Square Garden, and the many other moments when she had to decide how to balance love and boundaries, support and tough love. She has become an advocate for families dealing with addiction, sharing her story in the hope that other parents might find comfort in knowing they are not alone in their pain. The legacy of Whitney Houston is complex. She was undeniably one of the greatest voices of our time, an artist who changed the landscape of popular music and inspired millions. But she was also a woman who struggled with demons that ultimately consumed her, a daughter who never quite escaped the weight of expectations and pressure. For Cissy Houston, her daughter's legacy is more personal. It is measured not in record sales or awards, but in the moments they shared, the love they maintained even through the darkest times, and the knowledge that Whitney died knowing she was loved exactly as she was. Not as Whitney Houston the superstar, but as Whitney, Cissy's baby girl, who sang like an angel and struggled like a human being. The night Cissy Houston walked backstage at Madison Square Garden and discovered the truth about her daughter's addiction changed everything. It ended the pretending, forced difficult conversations, and began a new chapter in their relationship defined by painful honesty. It was the beginning of the end in many ways, the first step on a road that would eventually lead to Whitney's death. But it was also an act of love, a mother refusing to look away from her daughter's pain, choosing presence over comfort, and maintaining connection even when everything else was falling apart. For anyone who has ever loved someone struggling with addiction, Cissy Houston's story is a reminder that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is simply be there, be honest, and refuse to give up hope even when hope seems foolish. We cannot always save the people we love, but we can love them through their struggle, stand with them in their darkness, and pray that love, even when it is not enough, is still something. This is the story of a night when a mother's worst fears were confirmed, when the facade fell away and the truth could no longer be denied. It is a story about Whitney Houston, one of the greatest artists of our time, and her mother Cissy, who loved her daughter more than life itself but could not love her enough to save her. It is a story that millions of families have lived in their own ways, and it is a story that needs to be told so that others know they are not alone in their pain, their fear, and their love.